Hey guys, what's going on? It's Broken Nose Gaming here. Now I know in my recent videos I've been kind of on a tech kick. I know my most recent video before this was about the Alienware Alpha R2. Video before that was about some budget gaming peripherals that we found at Micro Center. And then of course I've talked about my budget pink gaming PC that I built, or the Daily Driver blue PC that I use now. Now this video is not going to be about them. As I have said previously, I'm not going to really be bringing up those systems anymore. I think I've kind of talked to them to death. This video is a little different. It's not meant to be super serious. It's just I ended up cleaning out my PC, as I do every once in a while, deleting documents and stuff I don't need anymore, and I came across this like little notepad document that basically kind of chronicled my PC builds that I've done in the past. Now it's not a complete list, and the only reason I say it's not a complete list is I've been building PCs since I was a teenager. So I come from the era of slot CPUs, AGP graphics cards, PCI, not PCIe, just PCI slots, or even older than that, ISA slots. I've seen a lot of things. I've seen the Pentium 3s, I've seen the Pentium 4s, I've seen the various AMD Athlons, I've seen the first 64-bit CPUs and stuff like that that were offered to the general public. That list does not include any of that stuff that I found, mainly because I was a teenager. I wasn't documenting that stuff back then. And also that stuff is pretty old too. I mean, like those AGP graphics cards that I owned, I had like a GeForce FX 5200. Not a very good card back then, definitely not a very good card now, and those video card capacities were like 128 megabytes. So they were just, it's all pretty old stuff, and I don't think it's super really interesting to talk about because the games back then are different than the games that are now. This list starts at when I started building PCs for a reason, and on that list, the very first PC that I started with was a PC that I built to play Star Wars: The Old Republic. I had missed the Star Wars MMO that was called Galaxies by the time I was old enough to get into those games or understand them. The game had long since been dead. There were private servers. The private servers were ghost towns. There just wasn't anything there. So when I heard about Star Wars: The Old Republic, I was actually really excited because it was going to be my first MMO that I could play Star Wars, and it was with other people, so I was really excited for that. So I needed to build a PC that could handle that game. I ended up finding an LGA 775 motherboard that was actually produced by Intel. I can't remember the chipset name, but it was like a WV41 or something like that. And it had like a Celeron single core or something in it. It was not very good. So I tossed the Celeron out, and I ended up going to Micro Center. And at the time, Micro Center was dumping LGA 775 stuff because it was being replaced. I ended up getting a Core 2 Duo E6700 for the motherboard, and then I needed a graphics card. I ended up getting a GTS 450 originally from MSI, and that video card lasted all one day before spontaneously combusting, no joke, and I had to take it back to Micro Center to get it refunded. I was really kind of hesitant to get another MSI card, so I was suggested to pick up a GTX 460 from EVGA. I'll go ahead and I'll throw that up on the screen. So the GTX 460 was a 1GB card, and it was actually pretty powerful. I believe it was actually a little bit more up-spec than other GTX 460s of the time, and it handled Star Wars: The Old Republic just fine. I used it for a while. I think the limiting factor then became the E6700, or something happened to the CPU. I can't remember what, or the board died. Something happened, and I ended up having to toss the whole system out, and I had to start again. If I was to grade the GTX 460, I would say it was a solid B tier card. The only reason it's not an A is the Fermi architecture is not the best, and it is not remembered as the best. It was actually a very toasty card. I believe it had some other problems as well, the architecture of Fermi, so I can't say it was the best card I've ever owned, but it was a pretty good card, and it definitely did its job, and I liked it. So coming off the 775 dying, and I didn't know what to do, I turned to AMD for my next build. Now AMD had this really neat thing that had just come out recently when I decided to build this PC. It was a APU. It was the very first like series of APUs that AMD had dropped. So the APU had graphics on board of the actual chip that you dropped into the motherboard, and you didn't need a graphics card. But AMD also had this really neat thing where you could pair up a graphics card with the APU and they would run in dual graphics mode, which was kind of like a discount Crossfire. It didn't work as well. Supposedly would get you like 50% more performance depending on your configuration. So the second build that I did was a AMD A10 5800K APU, which was like the top end APU of the line, and I paired it with a MSI Radeon HD 6670. Now the 6670 was supposed to be an okay card. I kind of got bamboozled. The MSI card that I bought, which I can't remember the full name of it, but it'll be up on the screen. It was not a good card. It kind of was one of the first ones where you had the like the onboard VRAM should have been like GDDR5 and it ended up being GDDR3 on this model. It was slower, it consumed less power, so like it was kind of like, it was one of those like, oh, it's the same name but it has worse specs. And I didn't know any better at the time because I didn't know that there were varying levels of like GPUs of the same name. So it's kind of like the RTX 4070 GDDR6 versus the 4070 GDDR6X of today. The 6670 did okay-ish. It could still play Star Wars: The Old Republic. I think I started playing World of Tanks as well with the 6670. They did okay. It wasn't the best. The dual graphics, like I said, was kind of a gimmick. I bet I probably wasn't getting that much more performance than I would have gotten out of either just using the APU by itself or just the 6670 by itself. But due to the poor specifications of this card, this was probably the worst graphics card I had ever owned, and I would definitely say it was a D tier card. The 6670 from MSI was just not good, and it had bad reviews about overheating as well, which kind of made me hesitant about buying the card after reading those reviews and remembering what happened to the GTS 450. So that system, I did stay on that system for a while though, and that was probably because I thought the dual graphics gimmick was going to get me pretty far. The APU was still based on, what was that terrible architecture that AMD had, Bulldozer or Pile Driver or whatever. Those, the processor part of it was not that good, and eventually it kind of showed its age and did not age very well. So I kind of ended up getting really frustrated with the system once it started kind of like not performing nearly as good as it was in the past. So after the AMD APU, I kind of got into console gaming for a little bit. I kind of put the other games that I used to play on hold. At the time, Star Wars: The Old Republic was a subscription-only game, and World of Tanks was very unpolished compared to what it is today. So I didn't feel like I was missing out too much, so I did some console gaming for a while. I'd always had consoles. I had PS1s, PS2s. I ended up getting the PS3, 4, and then I had the 360, and I had the Xbox One. And I did console gaming. The consoles did eventually coexist with my PCs for a while, and then I've kind of phased myself out of the console world. The only thing I have is my PS1 and 2. I have like a Nintendo Wii, and I believe I have an Xbox One that I specifically have just for Red Dead Redemption 1, because you cannot play that game on the PC. But I ended up drifting back into the PC world, and my next build, I went to Intel, and I started doing research. I started doing my own research about like what's good, what's not good, instead of just clicking the first website for them and seeing what somebody said was the best card. And I ended up with a new build, and this build was a i5 4690K, which was pretty darn good. I think it was considered like best bang for the buck in the era, unless you went into the i7s, which I didn't have the money for. So I got a 4690K MSI motherboard, and I paired it with my first 2GB card, and now that I think about it, my only 2GB card, which was another Radeon card. It was the Radeon HD 7870 MYST edition. Now the MYST edition 7870 is kind of special to me because it was my first like custom card, or like it was different. So there was the 7870, and then there was the 7870 MYST or PCS or whatever you want to call it. The difference between the two was the 7870 was one style core. I can't remember the name of it. I think it was Pictaran. And then the 7870 MYST, I believe, was based on the Tahiti core, which was related to the 7900 series GPUs that they had made. The 7870 was kind of like a cut down 7950 using the same core. Looking back at it now, I actually did some research on it, and the reviews now kind of make the 7870 MYST look like it wasn't that good of a card, because you were kind of like this weird middle ground. You were better than a 7870, but you were not as good as a 7950. So long story short, like, people now regard this card probably as not as good as it really was. But for me, the 7870 MYST was probably like my first A-tier card. I was really excited with this card because it was cool to have something that was more powerful than the standard version, yet was still like in the 7800 like class of cards, and I got it on sale, so like the pricing difference wasn't nearly that bad. It was very similar to buying a 7870 of the time, and it was just exciting to me. Like I said, I feel like the 7870 MYST to me was an A-tier card, and it wasn't performing at 1080p levels, but I wasn't playing at 1080p levels at this point. I believe I still had my entirely square monitor that I had bought from Fry's Electronics. It was like 19 inches. So the 4690K system stayed with me for a while. It did start eating RAM, which was really interesting. I would just start having RAM not post, or it would give me the BIOS errors that the RAM sticks were going bad, and I did that a few times, and then eventually the system just kind of killed itself, and I wasn't sure if the 4690K was savable or if the 7870 MYST was even savable. So I had gotten some life out of it, but once it started eating the RAM sticks and then just kind of frying itself, I didn't know what to do. I had thought about going back to console, but I instead went to Micro Center again, because at this point I think Fry's Electronics was on their last legs, and I built a new system. The new system was a AMD, and this is was my first step back into AMD, to where I really hadn't gone back to Intel. So the next system that I built was a Ryzen R5 2600. It was my first 6-core processor, and I took it home and I reluctantly threw the 7870 in there, and it handled it okay. I did realize though that the 7870 was dated at this point, so I ended up scrounging some money together and I picked up a Radeon RX 480, and this was my very first 8GB graphics card. Now the RX 480 is another, I'd say, pretty good card. I wouldn't call it A tier, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but this was a solid B tier card. The RX 480 was one of the few AMD cards, or I'm sorry, I don't even think it was AMD at the time, it was just Radeon, but it was one of the few cards that were competing pretty closely with the NVIDIA offerings at the time, and it did pretty well. And I used the RX 480 for quite some time with the 2600. The only thing I didn't like about it was I had bought a reference model that was a blower card. Now this was my very first blower card in my life. I did not know about blower cards. I had only used aftermarket models that had like the axial fans on there. So this blower card was confusing to me because it was running very hot, and it sort of reminded me of where the GTX 460 was running really hot too. So I was a little worried. I used it for a while, but I ended up replacing it with a RX 590. Now the RX 590, I will say, was much better than the 480, but I'd say for the 480 it was a solid B tier card. If it wasn't for the blower and me not having the understanding of why the blower cards ran hot, I would have given it a higher grade. But the RX 590 that replaced it was definitely an A tier card. It was made by Sapphire. It was like the highest end RX series card that was available. It was literally just kind of a bumped up RX 480. It performed better, it ran cooler because it had dual axial fans instead of a blower, and I was playing 1080p with it at this point. The RX 480, I believe, also had some 1080p action done on it, because I had finally gotten 24-inch ViewSonic 1080p monitor. It was my very first 1080p monitor. It wasn't a very good 1080p monitor, but it introduced me into the world of 1080p. It was only like a 60 hertz refresh rate. I didn't understand refresh rate at the time. I was still learning about that. The ViewSonic monitor did okay. I eventually retired it because I think the power button started sticking. And when I got the 590, I also ended up getting a curved MSI 27-inch high refresh, which I think is either 120 or 144 hertz monitor. And that was my first like high refresh monitor, and it was my first or my second 1080p monitor, my first curved monitor, my only curved monitor actually. It did pretty well. I had the 590 for a little while, and then I got surprised on my birthday with a NVIDIA card, and this is like I said, the 590 was an A tier card. It was the peak Radeon ATI AMD card. It was the last one that I've ever used. I was reintroduced to NVIDIA, and I got a GTX 1080. It was a refurbished GTX 1080. Now, granted, the 1080 was older than the RX 590. It definitely performed better than the 590, and this was my sort of transfer into the NVIDIA world again, because I had an NVIDIA in the very beginning, switched over to ATI Radeon, stayed with them for a very long time up until the 590, and then I jumped ship over to the NVIDIA game again. The GTX 1080 was really good. It was better than the RX 590. It was also a blower card, but at this point in my life, I had done more research about blower cards and why they ran hotter, so I sort of understood blower cards better, and I ended up learning how to tune a fan curve. And the other thing too was the GTX 1080 was a Founders Edition, and it seemed to run cooler than other blower style GTX series cards. So I was really happy with the 1080, and I used the 1080 for a while up until I got my first RTX series card, which was my very favorite EVGA RTX 3070. Now, by the time I got the 3070, the 2600 Ryzen had been sold off. I had gotten rid of the system, and I had a, what was it, a Ryzen 5600X. I got like one of the first launch 5600Xs, and I used that for a while. This also was when I jumped back to Intel, because I built a secondary computer, and it was a 11th gen. I used the 11th gen, and the 3070 ran with the 11th gen, and it also ran with my current system, which is the Ryzen 5700X. The RTX 3070 definitely is an A tier card. It's my favorite RTX series card. The only downsides about the 3070 is it doesn't have a whole lot of VRAM. It's only at 8 gigabytes, which was kind of a bummer, because the 30 series was like that turning point where VRAM started to change and go higher. Like the architecture and everything for the 30 series cards is really good. I really like the 3070. The only other issues that I had heard about the 30 series was they seem to degrade pretty quickly. I heard a lot of people like repasting and repadding in under a year. These things had massive coolers on them, and they apparently ran hotter than I thought. I didn't personally have any problems with my 3070, but I didn't want to chance it. It's now sort of like a collectible piece. EVGA doesn't make graphics cards anymore, and I really wanted to hold on to my 3070, so I took it out of the system and I replaced it with what I'm running now, which is my RTX 4070 from Asus. It is the tough gaming model. The 4070, I mean, it's not a huge step up from the 3070. I think, to put it in perspective, it's probably like jumping to like a 3080. I will say, though, when it comes to power efficiency, the 3070 is a little more power hungry than the 4070. You can get away with using one 8-pin power connector on a 4070, where I think on my 3070 I was using 2, which still isn't that much, because I mean 3080s and 3090s were using like 3. I will say I'm pleased with the power efficiency of the 4070, but in terms of like performance, it's okay. My biggest gripe about my 4070 is just it's got poor build quality. The heat sink that I mentioned in a previous video being slightly bent. It's just bad QC, and that kind of gives it a B tier. If it was as nicely built as the 3070 was, it'd be a different story. But it's just the build quality that really kind of bummed me out, having a bent heatsink. And I wasn't the only one that had that problem. I had mentioned in my previous video, there were a lot of people that had problems with bent 4070s and 4070 Ti's from Asus in the tough range. So, I don't know, build quality issue, I guess, but it's enough to warrant it a B. That is the history of my graphics cards. So I would say my high points are definitely the 7870 MYST, the 590, the 1080 was a good card, my 3070 was a great card, my 4070 was an okay card, my 460 was a good card, ran a little hot. My 6670 is absolutely the worst card I've ever owned, and that was because I was uneducated and didn't know that there were memory differences and stuff like that that existed within the same line of graphics cards as they still do today. But this is just a look back on my graphics cards and my PC builds that I've done over the years. And I mean, you know, this isn't meant to be like super serious. I'm not trying to dump on either company. I've used both AMD and Intel. I've used ATI/AMD and NVIDIA. I've definitely had some pretty cool graphics cards in my lifetime, and I've had some duds. But yeah, this is just something, I mean, this is just another little weird kind of tech video. Anyways, if you watched the whole video, thank you. You are a trooper for listening to me ramble for way too long. And until I see you in the next video, take it easy. Bye-bye.